why I think are quite often somewhat dubious about liberty and equality as political values. It's not so much they say, well, we're against liberty and against equality. More they say, look, what is important is that each citizen should have a place in the social order in which he feels at home. Critics might say, and indeed where she is at home, namely pointing to the way in which some conservatives take the traditional view that the place of women properly is in the home rather than in the public sphere. If we turn from ideals to programs, again, things are a little tricky to describe, just because conservatives tend to be resistant at looking at politics in terms of abstract programs and abstractions more generally. But I think if we go carefully, we can actually throw some light on what conservative approaches are like here. First of all, they tend to stress the significance of statesmanship. And they see this often as a learned craft or almost a practical skill. One might here contrast this attitude or approach to the way in which liberals will often appeal to abstract formulae, for example, about rights. In order to get a feel for this, it's possibly useful to consider the example, say, of a chef. A chef is someone who, at his best, is typically someone who's had an apprenticeship. It's a sort of craft skill. And one might, to get a feel for the contrast, say, look, suppose that the teaching company were to offer you a dinner out in Washington, D.C. somewhere, and you had a choice between two restaurants. One of these had a chef who had served his apprenticeship in Paris. Really over many years, he'd served indeed in various different restaurants, and you could go there. He'd now opened his own restaurant. The other restaurant had been opened by someone who had a master's degree in food science and a very, very large collection of recipe books. Now, my own feeling is if you wanted to have a good meal, as opposed to an interesting, in quotation marks, experience, you'd go to the first of these rather than the second. There's a sense in which being a chef and being able to prepare things, it's a matter of know-how rather than abstract knowledge. And what conservatives will often say is, look, the same is actually true about politics, and that it's a mistake to take the kind of recipe book approach to how things should work in that area. Second, conservatives typically stress that people's characters and institutions have a kind of interconnection, and that they should be valued because they have passed the test of time. Our inherited institutions, in a sense, have been tried out and work. They've stood the test of time. Another way of looking at this might be to say, well, okay, and we can consider that we're sort of used to them and know how to handle them, know how to do things with them. One example that's been given to me, but I can't quote it from my own experience, it relates to fishing. Imagine, say, that someone has got a fishing rod that they have got very used to. Now, it may not be the best possible fishing rod, but they may by now have a feel for just what its strengths and weaknesses are and know how to work with it. And the argument is, look, in politics, our existing institutions may not be perfect, but we know a lot about them. We know, in a sense, how to do things with them, what their limitations are, and how to handle them. So you get an affection for inherited institutions. You also get a stress on the value of so-called intermediate institutions standing between the government and its citizens. Why are these important? Well, first of all, for conservatives, they serve to give individuals an identity. Who are you? Well, this may often be a matter of your nationality, but it may also relate to your membership of particular organizations. Someone may be a member of the Moose or whatever, or a Mason or whatever, and this may for them be an important part of who they are. It's also, from a conservative perspective, historically been important in terms of securing particular liberties and as serving as checks on arbitrary power. Compare, for example, historically, the role that an institutionally powerful church sometimes may have been able to play in relation to the government, really serving as an important check on it. A similar theme has also actually been found in some liberal writers, for example, de Tocqueville. And in later lectures, I'm going to talk about some issues connected with intermediate institutions in connection with so-called social capital. Quite an interesting and thought-provoking discussion. The Conservatives also stress the importance of building dispositions and character on the part of citizens, on which the working of institutions then depends. Conservatives stress that we are shaped by institutions in which we participate and in our education. And to put this in not very conservative terminology, this both empowers us but also limits our flexibility and our ability to adopt others' institutions. That's to say, on the one side, you have the notion that if things are working well, the kind of informal education and shaping that people get in a particular country allows the institutions of that country to function well. At the same time, you might see this kind of training as leading to certain limitations on people. For example, my own training, as it were, as a sedentary scholar, and particularly that part of it which is reflected by my girth, kind of stands in the way of my becoming perhaps a champion pole vaulter. And there's a sense in which, okay, I may be the wrong shape for that, but I am perhaps the right shape for a lecturer or for someone who's working in archives and things of that kind. That's to say, I've got various sorts of dispositions which enable me to do some things, but which block me from doing other things. And the Conservative will often say, look, these things are really important and often badly neglected in terms of our understanding of how our own institutions work, but also when facing problems about the transfer of institutions from one country to another. And Conservatives typically were not at all surprised about the failure to make an easy transfer of the institutions of liberal democracy from Western countries to the former Soviet Union. I mean, they would have said, look, you just couldn't expect things to work simply or smoothly because people in that country have been shaped to fit in with various other kinds of institutions. You're forgetting, in a sense, when you look at the US or Britain or Western European countries, about the way in which those institutions only work as they do because of what the character is of the people living in those countries. Conservatives also often stress the importance of political leadership and value loyalty to leaders, tying in a sense, with the notion of statecraft as a practical skill. They often also stress the importance of property. Why? Well, it isn't, as some of their critics might think, because they've got a lot of property and sort of like to enjoy it. Rather, they say property at a certain level, even almost at a trivial level, is important in connection with the development of people's personalities. For example, consider how an artist needs materials on which to work in order to express him or herself. Take, for example, someone who is a potter. There's a sense in which they may have very considerable talent, but unless they've actually got the stuff on which to work, they can't, in a sense, fully develop themselves. And Conservatives often want to say you have to look at property, particularly personal property, in these sorts of terms. It's not just simply stuff out there in the world. It's something through which, in a sense, we develop ourselves by working on it, by accumulating things. I mean, there's a sense in which, as we go through our lives, we typically accumulate quite a lot of stuff to which we have a strong personal attachment. And Conservatives may often say, yes, this indeed is one proper role that property is playing, helping us to externalize ourselves, to grow in the world, and we need security over that property if it's going to play that sort of role. Second, Conservatives may say that historically property has been important as a barrier against the use of power. For example, even today it may be the case that if you have some people who are members of a religious sect, life may be really pretty difficult for them if they're just living in the world generally. But if they happen to recruit someone who's got a large estate somewhere, they can go off onto the estate and sort of quietly get on with things, and they're in a way protected from intrusion by other people, from too close a surveillance by the government, and things of that kind. So you have this notion of property as a barrier against the possible abuse of power by other people. You also, though, within traditional conservatism, get a notion of property ownership as bringing with it obligations. One may here think of something like a traditional picture of the owner of a large landed estate, who, in addition to owning things, has got an obligation, on the one side, towards the land itself, cultivating it, looking after it, and so on, and also he or she may have paternalistic feelings towards those people who are employed on the land and really feel that it's their job, to a degree at least, to try and take care of those people rather than just seeing them as being people who can be fired just if there's a quick downturn in the economy or something like that. Conservatives also believe that the nation is important. Why?